Now, I'm sure you probably still have a bunch of questions from some of the things that you've just heard, but I promise you we're going to start answering some more of them now. It is my pleasure to introduce our Vice President of Audiology, Dr. Don Schum.
Thank you. I want to add my welcome to those that you've already heard this morning, and we sincerely appreciate the fact that all of you have been willing to give up some of your important weekend time to join us here to see what we have created for you to help serve your patients better. All of us in this room are in the hearing profession. We have a goal, a mission to try to help those who suffer from hearing loss to be able to lead a better life. But to follow up on some of the themes that you've already heard, we are also in the senses profession. Sometimes in our field, we get a little bit narrow about the way we think about the jobs we do because we have a lot to do to just worry about the hearing mechanism. But as you can tell, one of the themes that we're working on very strongly with this launch with the Inium Sense products is the idea that hearing shouldn't be seen in isolation. Hearing shouldn't be seen as something that exists just as an isolated sense, but rather it's part of a conglomeration of all the senses the person feels. I'm going to not skew quite as ancient as Maria. She talked about Aristotle. I'm only going to go back for 300 years to Berkeley and have you read what he wrote about the sensation of a cherry. That when you experience a cherry, what your experience is the sum total of all of your senses experiencing that cherry. And the cherry doesn't exist only by vision, and it doesn't exist only by the sound it makes when you chew into it, and it doesn't exist only in taste, but it exists in all those aspects. And the way the humans put together all their senses becomes very important. Our cognitive system was developed to do a specific job, and that specific job was to tell the person what's happening in the world around them. Back in the early days of man, it was based on very primitive sort of needs. What are the threats in my environment? What could eat me, right? What are the opportunities in my environment? Where are food? Where is a suitable mate for me? That's what the cognitive system was developed to do early on. As humans have evolved and developed over the centuries, it's become a more sophisticated system. But it does get back to the primary function of the cognitive system is to take all that information that's coming in, all that input that's coming into the brain, and piece it together and tell the person what's going on in the world around them. You don't experience sound as isolated sound. You hear sound as music or speech or something that has a bigger meaning. The cognitive psychologists talk about the cognitive system as creating objects or events, that your perception of the world around you is based on the sum total of information that you're bringing in from all the senses and from your stored information that you have in your brain, and creates a sense of what's happening out there in the world. What did somebody say? What is that sound that I hear? What does it mean that I need to be more careful about what I'm doing? There's a great story from the field of audiology that I want to share with you. Some of you may know this story, but I'm sure that many of you do not know the story. As you know, the field of audiology became formalized back in the second half of the 1940s. And it became a necessary field because there was many veterans returning from World War II who had lost their hearing. And one of the observations that was being made by the medical staff was that there was a lot of depression and anxiety that was building up in these veterans who were coming back after losing their hearing. And it seems like, well, that should be pretty obvious what's going on. But they wanted to make sure that they truly understood what was going on with this loss of hearing in these veterans. So they contracted with a psychologist named Donald Ramsdell to look into it, to do interviews with these veterans and to really put some sort of structure to the knowledge that we're gaining about the loss of hearing, this rapid loss of hearing. And Ramsdell wrote a chapter in the original book, Davis and Silverman. Now, you don't have to admit anything about your age, but many of us who are of my generation of audiologists, we grew up on Davis and Silverman, right? Show of hands, how many of it? Yep, that's what I thought. You youngsters in the audience, you missed something great, and that was Davis and Silverman. David and Silverman was the audiology Bible when I was a young punk. And this chapter that Ramsdell wrote in the late 40s was republished and republished and republished basically in its original form in Davis and Silverman after each edition came out because it was so fundamental. The fundamental thing that Ramsdell did in that chapter was describe the levels of hearing. What does hearing do for the human? And he described 3 levels of hearing. The first 2 are on the screen, the symbolic level of hearing and the warning level of hearing. The symbolic level of hearing is the way we use speech and language. It's the way we use abstract sound formation to communicate information and ideas from person to person. The warning level is very obvious. It's using our hearing to keep us alive. Back in the early days of man, it was to keep from being eaten in the jungle. More recently is to keep from being run over by the bus, or from what most of you have experienced this winter, snowplows going down the street. But the fundamental insight that Ramsdell made that was so important was that there was a 3rd level of hearing. And he described this as the primitive level of hearing. And he believed that that was what these veterans lost. The primitive level of hearing is our connection to the world around us, that sense that you are just in the world, and that the sounds of everything around you connect you with that world. And the depression and the anxiety that these suddenly deafened veterans were experiencing, he believes was tied to this rapid loss of this primitive level of hearing, this just simple connection to the world around you that comes with the sound around you. As you sit there in your seats, the primary auditory signal, I hope, that you're hearing and I hope you're paying attention to is my voice. But there's a lot of other sounds in this world, and there's a lot of other sounds in this room. And you might think, well, I simply ignore them. And that's true. Your cognitive system does suppress those sounds for you. But if they weren't there, think how dead this room would be. Many of you have probably had the opportunity to walk out into an anechoic chamber. And one of the first things you notice when you walk into an anechoic chamber is how dead it feels. That there's not even reverberation even of your footsteps. And it's a very strange experience. I'm going to give you an example of this statement. The world we experience should match the world in which we exist. And what is very important about the way we're discussing this as part of this launch is that the world we experience is the sum total of all our sensations. This is not a technical glitch. There is no sound there. But I want you to imagine what the sound should be. In that setting, how did it sound? More importantly, how did it smell? Did you smell the freshly roasted coffee? Freshly ground beans? How did it feel in the room? Was it cold and drafty? Was it warm and cozy? The point I'm trying to make is that the visual example you just saw, when you heard it without sound, there was something clearly missing, and it was odd. But you expect it to sound a couple different ways. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to play 2 more versions of this same film sample with 2 different soundtracks in it. And I want you just to listen to the 2 different soundtracks and think about how you felt about these 2 different soundtracks. So let's go ahead and listen to the first one. Which one sounded more correct to you? Most of you are probably thinking it was the second one, because there was just something about that background that seemed to match what you were seeing visually, right? Some of you may have thought it was the first one, but the amount of clatter in the first one, the amount of going on just didn't seem to match. That hustle and bustle sound didn't quite seem to match what you're seeing visually. And that's the point, is that first sample with that louder, more hectic soundtrack was one that just didn't coalesce with all the other sensations you're having. The problem with sensorineural hearing loss is that loudness difference between those two samples, for example, that can be off for patients with sensorineural hearing loss. That even in the second sample you saw, where most of you, those of you who have normal hearing, probably felt that, yeah, that's about the way it should sound. But if you have sensorineural hearing loss, even that might not sound right. It might sound very loud, or it might sound inaudible. But the point being that if you don't get the sound of an environment to be consistent with all the other sensations you have in the environment, then the senses can't coalesce together. The world we experience should match the world in which we exist. What we know as professionals is that sensorineural hearing loss can throw this off. Creating sensorineural hearing loss can give us a restricted access to the full world of sound, including, very importantly, the soft parts of the speech signal at various different input levels. Even if we hear the sound coming up through a disordered peripheral auditory system, we know that the patients have to put in extra effort in order to hear the sound. And in a situation like you just saw from that coffee shop scene, people shouldn't have to work hard to hear a conversation in an environment like that. It was nice and muted down. It was lively, but certainly not too loud. But a patient with sensorineural hearing loss would be in a setting like that and just have to work harder because of the nature of the disorder that they're treating. And sometimes you can get the very extreme condition where the brain starts to make up sounds. And you know all of you know that as tinnitus. And so when we talk about the senses and getting hearing aligned with the rest of the senses, we're talking about trying to create, as best as we possibly can for your patients, this concept that their hearing becomes a natural part of everything else they experience, and everything becomes back in balance and back aligned. For the past year, we've been talking about brain hearing. And brain hearing is our concept of feeding the brain the right information at the right time, delivered in the right way. And we do that in many different ways. Technologies we have, such as SpeechGuard-E, our free focus directional system, our tri-state noise management system, the VAC fitting rationale, all of those have been designed and implemented in our products over the years in order to try to get the right information to the brain so that the person can get as much information as possible out of the signal. As we move forward with this launch, with the products on the Inium Sense platform, we're creating a new focus where we're expanding our view of brain hearing to see how we can do the very best job of getting hearing to integrate with the full sensory experience. So that hearing doesn't just allow access to information, but allows access to information in the most natural and the most fulfilling way for the person, so their total sensory experience is as positive as it possibly can. When the ear misbehaves, and you all know that the ears misbehave, the effects are individualistic. One of the core tenets of the brain hearing concept is that the effects of hearing loss vary significantly from person to person. In this launch, we are focusing on two very specific examples of where the individualistic nature of the effects of hearing loss can really change a person's enjoyment of sound and their ability to get information from the speech signal through the disordered auditory system. The first example is what we need to do to properly make sounds audible. One of the key jobs of amplification, as you know, is to make the speech signal available to the person, make it audible. And over the years, we've created a lot of different approaches in this field to make it work well. are focusing in at this point in time is the details of making sounds audible the best possible way for the individual patient. Because there's just a lot more about sensorineural hearing loss that we're learning every day that we can tap into and capitalize on to make the hearing experience as positive as possible for the patients you serve. VAC Plus with Soft Speech Booster, as you know, is one of the new features that we're talking about this time period. VAC, for those of you who are relatively new to us, is our fitting rationale, voice-aligned compression. We released voice-aligned compression over 10 years ago, and we created it for very specific reasons that I'll talk about in just a few moments. What we're doing with the release of the products on the Enium Sense platform is we're expanding the reach of the VAC fitting rationale to make available more soft speech sounds for many of the patients who get fit with hearing aids that have the VAC fitting rationale. This new feature is called Soft Speech Booster. The original VAC that we released, as I said, just a little over 10 years ago, was based on loudness data that was collected at Northeastern University in Boston by Søren Boos and Mary Florentine. And what they did, the reason why that paper was so important in our field was that they challenged the notion that most psychoacousticians had about the way a person with sensorineural hearing loss experiences the loudness of sounds. Normal hearing individuals, once sound gets above threshold, it starts off as feeling sounding very soft, and then moderately soft, and then moderate and moderately loud, and then loud. And we always assumed that patients with sensorineural hearing loss went through those same steps. One of the things that these two researchers pointed out is that's not always true, that there is a concept called softness in perception that they introduced into the nomenclature that we use. And what it said was that many patients with sensorineural hearing loss don't experience sounds right above threshold as being truly soft. They're already sounding moderate to the patient. The concepts that they created in their fitting, in the data that they created about loudness, we built into the original VAC fitting rationale. More recently, Merzau and Florentine followed up on that original paper to take a look at the individual nature of loudness perception in patients with sensorineural hearing loss. In the original data, it looked like there was some variability, and in this follow-up paper, they really want to get a sense for what the true range of variability was. And that's exactly what they did. And what became very clear in that follow-up paper is that this perception of soft sound was very varied from patient to patient to patient. As we had the capability to create a more effective feedback system, that gave us the great opportunity to start dealing with this soft sound perception more effectively in our products. And that's exactly what you have with Soft Speech Booster and VAC Plus. Let me show you how it shows up in the way we'd approach a patient. On this graph, what you see on the y-axis are the loudness categories that you can walk through as sounds get louder and louder. The long curved blue line is loudness perception of the typical person with normal hearing. That as soon as sound gets a little bit above threshold, it's very soft, and then soft, and it goes through the categories. The yellow line marked Bob, the generic Bob line, shows what happens in loudness perception for a person with 50 dB of hearing loss under the traditional assumption that patients with sensorineural hearing loss go through those same categories. So Bob, as soon as sound gets a little bit above threshold, it's very soft, and then soft, and moderate, soft, and loud, etc. That would be the classic loudness recruitment that we've used before, that the patient with sensorineural hearing loss has a restricted range of hearing, and so they go through loudness categories quicker, and that's what we refer to as loudness recruitment. But what the softness in perception data suggests is that there's a lot of patients out there with sensorineural hearing loss who actually respond more like Sam, the generic Sam, where as soon as sound gets a little bit above threshold, Sam has the same 50 dB hearing loss, but already those sounds are perceived as moderate. The point being that the amount of access you provide to soft sounds, especially the soft parts of the speech signal, need to be individually set so that the perception of soft sound is very natural for those two different patients. The original VAC fitting rationale looked closer to the data for Sam than for Bob, because we wanted to be conservative about this and not overwhelm any patients. As we've created the capability to do more effective soft gain because of the new feedback system, and as we learn more about the individual variability in this area, and as we studied ways that we could individualize this dimension, we now are able to serve patients who are both Bob and Sam and anybody in between. The way that's managed in our software is through the soft speech booster, and it's a slider that changes the knee point of compression. Right, Jason and Mike were throwing around how technical they were. Yeah. Now I'm going to get technical. Actually not. The details of how this actually is implemented in Genie, you're going to get in the workshops this weekend. So I'm not going to go into that detail. But what we've done is built into the fitting software the ability to change access to soft sounds based on moving the knee point. And that's a personalizable dimension. It's built into the personal profile page. We have a new sound sample specifically to try to find the difference between Sam and Bob. And then the products will be fit based on that data that we collect. You've heard this number, that with Soft Speech Booster, you can get up to 20% improved speech recognition. Now, we specifically chose that language to be provocative. And we specifically chose that language to emphasize the point that this is a personalizable dimension. When we say up to 20% improved speech recognition, of course what that means is not everybody gets that, right? But if there are patients who used to respond more like Sam, but now could actually respond more like Bob and use soft sound more effectively, those are the patients who can get a big boost by giving them better access to soft speech. Up to 20% gives you the top end of the range. On average, we're seeing speech intelligibility improvements when you take a look at both soft speech and moderate speech, both in quiet and in noise, of on average around 8 or 9%. But the point being that when you have a range that indicates, just like every other psychoacoustic dimension that we've ever studied in sensorineural hearing loss, is that there's variation from patient to patient. So Soft Speech Booster isn't just about having the ability to give more soft gain to patients. It's about having the logic, having the knowledge base, and having the software-based tools to be able to find who needs more soft gain and who actually can do better with less soft gain. And we've built that into the personalization process, and you'll see that in the workshops this weekend. It's more than just loudness. In this case, what I was trying to simulate was the idea of amplifying the soft speech spectrum above threshold. And loudness is one of the dimensions that's very important, and this idea between Sam and Bob about how they perceive soft sounds or sounds right above threshold, whether or not they perceive it as soft or not, that's one of the things. But there's another aspect about sensorineural hearing loss that we know is that the ability to extract information from sound right above threshold also varies from patient to patient. So that if you provide an amplified signal right above threshold, some patients can reach down into that soft sound and really pull out information that they could use, and other patients are not going to be as efficient at doing that. And so that's another reason why this becomes a personalizable dimension. Because if the patient can't use the information and it doesn't sound natural, you don't want to be providing it. But if you can make it sound natural and they can extract important information from that, that's what you want to be able to do. And that's why some people get a lot of benefit from increased soft gain and some people don't get quite as much. Based on our estimates, we believe that approximately 85% of the patients who are fit with the new VAC plus fitting rationale will receive more gain for soft sounds than they have with the original VAC rationale, based on the way personal profile data is coming in. So most patients, the vast majority of patients, will be getting better access to soft speech. But again, it's a personalizable dimension, and it's core to our brain hearing concept. It's important to understand how much benefit patients can potentially get, but it's probably more important to understand how often they might be able to get this benefit. Because when we say soft speech booster, the initial reaction that you probably have, this is the initial reaction that I had when my colleagues in Denmark presented this concept to me, was that, well, okay, if that's for soft overall levels of speech, how often do those actually occur? We have data. This is a new set of data that we collected with the help of many of you who are in this room, where we collected activity analyzer data from 103 patients who were using Alta or Alta Pro. And we wanted to just understand more and more about the environments that patients actually find themselves in. So this is the average data from those 103 Alta and Alta Pro users. And as you can see that they're averaging, their average hour per day of use is over 11 hours per day. So these are active users of their hearing aids. And if it was only about soft speech, that would suggest about 25% of the time patients were in soft environments, meaning that if somebody was talking, it was probably going to be at a soft level. But it's not just about soft overall levels, and it's related to the acoustics of the speech signal. If you take the long-term average of speech, and most of you know that the long-term average of speech falls off as you go higher in frequency, and you average it in different frequency regions. And what I've done on this graphic is I've given the dividers of where our systems average the speech signal over time. We do one average up to 1,500 hertz, and then we do 3 different frequency regions where we average the speech signal. If you present speech at an overall level in the moderate range, in this case 65 dB SPL, the low frequency band is going to average out about 60 dB SPL, so that's going to be in that moderate range. But the 3 high frequency bands are still in the soft range, meaning that even for an overall moderate input level, so conversational level of speech, the high frequency parts of conversational level speech are actually soft. That's the soft parts of speech. And as you know, that's really where the really good stuff in speech occurs. As you know, the real good information in the speech signal is that mid to high frequency information, and that's soft speech. So when we talk about soft speech booster, it's not just about soft overall levels of speech. It's about soft and moderate overall levels of speech. So let's go back to this data and say, okay, how often are patients in environments where they're listening to both soft and overall moderate levels of speech? And it turns out to be over 75% of the time. So this potential benefit of 20% improvement in soft speech understanding, which should be stated as 20% improvement in speech understanding based on getting better access to the soft parts of speech, occurs over 75% of the time that patients are in environments. There's a second way that you can look at the data, and I want to do this because there's an important point I want to make. As you know, in the activity analyzer, the information that you could gain from the tri-state noise management will categorize different environments as either noise, quiet, speech and quiet, or speech and noise. So this is the overall average of those 103 Alta and Alta Pro users for the tri-state noise management. And if you take a look at the middle 2 sections, so speech and quiet and speech and noise, and when I say the middle 2 sections, I mean on the vertical dimension, and you calculate out the amount of time that patients are actually listening to speech, and then calculate out the amount of time that they're listening to speech that's either at moderate or soft levels, you get, again, this idea that over 75% of the time when speech is present in environments, it's present at either a moderate or soft level. So whether you look at it just in terms of the overall level or you take a look at it in terms of how often speech is present, you keep coming back to this number is that over 75% of the time, this benefit is potential for patients. Again, not all patients, because as we know, it's a personalizable dimension. But for those patients who get greater access to soft speech, it's a benefit that they're going to get a lot more often than you may have guessed. I want to go back to this data really quickly to make one point. If you notice in that moderate speech, so in that 50 to 60 dB range and the 60 to 70 dB range, a lot of time is spent in speech and noise, and that's that second from the top section. And it's important to understand that this better access to soft speech signals or the soft parts of speech, even in noise, becomes relevant. The explanation gets a little bit hairy, but I'll just take a moment to get through. When people are listening in noisy environments with other people talking, okay, that's the most common noisy environment that patients experience. And when you're listening to one talker with another conversation going on nearby, the noise in the high frequencies is not constant, right? It's just occasional phonemes or occasional syllables that jump up from the competing talkers. It turns out that the cognitive system is very opportunistic. One of the reasons why extended bandwidth becomes so important in hearing aids is because you never know at any moment in time when you're going to be able to find a chunk of speech information that's going to add to the overall perception for that patient. So even when they're in noisy environments, the cognitive system is constantly searching to try to find parts of speech that relate to the talker they're trying to concentrate on. I think it was Maria who mentioned the idea that you can tell the sound of a voice of someone you know really well just by hearing a little bit of speech from them. That's because the cognitive system is really good about putting together parts of speech and creating a link over time so that you understand what the person's saying. So the soft speech benefit is present even in the presence of background noise. In addition to that, we have two very specific brain hearing technologies that help out even more. SpeechGuard E and Free Focus Directional. Because SpeechGuard E, as you know, is trying to preserve the fine details of that speech waveform, especially in the high frequencies, that are going to allow that person to really lock on to extra information they may have access to. And then you have Free Focus Directional that goes into a directional mode that's going to help improve the signal-to-noise ratio. And one of the key features about Free Focus Directional is that unlike a lot of other manufacturers, by having the split directional mode, that allows directionality to be used in the product even down to moderate environments. So by having a very good, smart directional system in moderate environments that gives that benefit in the high frequencies, to have SpeechGuard E to really pull out the details of the speech signal, those are two extra technologies that are going to work really well with Soft Speech Booster to allow for this improvement in modern environments even when noise is present. There are other benefits to the Soft Speech Booster. It's improved environmental awareness, just having a better sense of everything that's going around you. And again, Ramsdell pointed out how important that is. Improved access to high-frequency spatial cues. When you can get softer, high-frequency spatial cues, that can allow the person to operate better in complex environments because they can help orient themselves in the environment, tell where sound's coming from, and focus on the signal of interest. And finally, as I said, one more time, this is a truly personalizable dimension. You want to find the patients who need the Soft Speech Booster and do everything you can to give them that information if that's something that's going to work well for them. I said that when the ear misbehaves, the effects are individualistic. One of the examples I used was the softness in perception aspect and how much variability we know is in there. The other big example, of course, that we're dealing with this launch is tinnitus. All of you know that many patients suffer from this condition, and many of you know that the effects and the response to treatment varies significantly from patient to patient to patient. Remember what tinnitus is. It is the loss of good input from the peripheral auditory system. And what modern concepts around the cause of tinnitus all conclude is that it's the reaction to the brain to this loss of input. Back when I entered the field back in the 80s, the belief was that tinnitus somehow was being caused in the periphery. It was hair cells creating sounds that really weren't out there. As it's been studied over the last 20 to 30 years, it's become more and more clear that it's not being generated in the periphery, but it's being generated somewhere in the central auditory system. And the key is when this input is shut down or disrupted coming from the periphery, how do the rest of the structures within the central auditory system and the rest of the brain respond to that loss of input? As you know, the central auditory system is very complex, and of course I'm not expecting you to read all the labels of the structures in the central auditory system. If you were paying attention in school, you know those labels, but I'm not going to test you. Okay. But the point being that any of those structures in the central auditory system, starting from the cochlear nucleus all the way up to the auditory cortex, any of those locations could be the source of the generation of tinnitus. Basically, what ends up happening is the belief is once the stimulation from the periphery is not coming in as it normally used to, then these structures, the nerve fibers in all these structures, or some of these structures, somehow respond oddly in some patients. And that response pattern, again, is a very individualistic issue, but it creates the sense of sound when no sound actually exists. So it goes back to this issue that the world we experience should match the world we live in. So tinnitus is almost the opposite of loss of audibility, right? Tinnitus is the fact that you're in an environment where there's not supposed to be sound, and I have to listen to sound because of my tinnitus. Let's talk about inhibition and the loss thereof. How many of you have seen 50 Shades of Grey? Oh. I'll let you chew on that for a second. Here is one potential cause of tinnitus. There's many that have been postulated, but I just wanted to use it just as an example. Okay. The auditory system, especially the central auditory system, is a very highly balanced, highly calibrated system. There's a lot of nerve fibers that are firing all the time. And one of the effects that keeps the central auditory system in balance is the idea of inhibition. That there are some nerve fibers in the auditory system whose job it is to suppress the response of other fibers, kind of keep them under control. And so one of the postulated causes of tinnitus, and again, like I said, it's not the only one, is the fact that when you don't get this normal input from the periphery, that somehow you throw out this balance of excitatory and inhibitory functions within the auditory system, so some of these nerve cells that were kept under control and being tamped down all of a sudden are free to just fire whenever they want. And that's one potential source of tinnitus, and that can occur at many different places in the auditory system. I'm not going to do a whole long talk for you on the neuroscience of tinnitus, but the point being is that the reaction in this highly complex, highly calibrated system does vary significantly from patient to patient to patient. And that's why finding a treatment for tinnitus becomes such a hard thing to get really pinned down well. The vast majority of professionals working in the area of tinnitus, and I know that many of you do that already, and so I'm actually not speaking to you right now. I'm really speaking to those hearing care professionals in here who have been thinking about whether or not tinnitus is something you want to get into. We know that many hearing care professionals have not actively been involved in tinnitus over the years for a lot of reasons. But as different pressures exist in the marketplace, and there is a need to justify the existence of the healthcare practitioner in the hearing provision process, that tinnitus is one of those areas where I know a lot of you are thinking, maybe that should be something that becomes a bigger part of my practice. The people who've been working in the area of tinnitus for a number of years and are really experts in the area say the key to tinnitus and the experience that the patient has is how the person responds to the presence of tinnitus. It is a physiological change, it is a physiological condition, but the key is emotionally, how does the person respond to the presence of tinnitus? There are many patients who have tinnitus where it's just there and they deal with it and it's no big deal. But those patients who are most difficult to help find a good solution are those patients, in many cases, where their emotional response to tinnitus becomes very, very strong. And so there's a lot of different treatment approaches that are out there, and I'll talk about them in just a second. But one of the keys to all these treatment approaches is understanding how the person views their tinnitus, how they experience the tinnitus, and whether or not they can somehow learn to live with the tinnitus better. In fact, if you take a look at the different approaches to managing tinnitus in patients, it's like taking a look at the different approaches of dealing with political scandal, right? You can either try to cover it up, make it go away, or learn to live with it. It's the same thing with tinnitus. Back in the early days of tinnitus treatment, the idea was to use a masker or a combination device, and if you got that masking noise loud enough, it would cover up the tinnitus and the patient wouldn't be bothered by it. It turns out that that doesn't happen all that often. Sometimes you can actually mask the tinnitus signal, but oftentimes you can't. Then it becomes somewhat problematical that, tinnitus bothers patients most in the quiet environment, just like falling asleep at night and things like that. Wearing maskers or combination devices at that point in time doesn't seem very practical, and so you have bedside maskers and things like that. As I said, as we've learned more and more about tinnitus over the years, the idea that you can totally cover it up becomes segmented out to a smaller number of the patients who deal with that. The second approach is to try to make the tinnitus go away. And that's where you get a lot of these medical or pseudo-medical treatments to try to make tinnitus disappear from the patient. In some relatively infrequent cases, putting a masker on a patient for a certain period of time and then taking it off will suppress the tinnitus for a certain amount of time, and then it'll come back after minutes or hours. If that happens, that's pretty good, but that doesn't happen all that often in patients. And then you have some of the very odd medical treatments, everywhere from herbal remedies to very invasive surgeries and things like that. There used to be a time where they would even try to cut the eighth nerve for patients who had very poor tinnitus. And what they ended up realizing was that tinnitus wasn't being generated in the periphery, it was being generated in the central auditory system because of lack of input from the periphery, and cutting the eighth nerve, well, that just made the problem worse. And so you have this whole range. But again, the number of patients where you can actually make tinnitus go away is pretty limited. As I said, most modern treatments of tinnitus, and again, if you know tinnitus well, you know this already, but most modern approaches to tinnitus deal with the idea of having the person learn to live with the tinnitus. That they use either some combination of maskers or combination devices, like our products now with tinnitus sound support, to do some inhibition training, to do some relaxation training, to just get to the patient to a point where they don't notice the tinnitus as much. It goes from a conscious awareness to a subconscious awareness. That they may use relaxation therapy to help the patient just not be bothered as much by it. But all of these approaches have a strong counseling component. And if you're considering the concept of trying to bring more and more tinnitus patients into your practice because you see that as a good growth opportunity, if you're going to do it, I absolutely will tell you have to be willing to understand the counseling approach and really be willing to go in with both feet about the counseling side of tinnitus. There are some hearing care professionals that I've met who are excellent in this area, but it is a skill set that has to be built up. How will we help? Well, clearly, the first thing that we did was to create the tinnitus sound support function in the Indium Sense products with the TI tag on them. And so we have a product where we have a series of products at different price levels that meets or exceeds the functionality of everything else in the marketplace. We studied this area very closely. We understood what other companies did well and what we could do at least as well, if not better. So when you see the details of the tinnitus solution in the products, you'll see that if you know anything about other people's products, that you're going to see that we have it covered. We've created some unique aspects about it, for example, the ocean sounds. And our clinical studies this past year with the tinnitus product that we had available in an experimental version show that these ocean sounds are the most effective in the patients that were being fit. In addition, we have the support materials that was talked about in the panel, and you'll see that in details in the workshops going forward today and in the Oticon Village. We also will be providing you with online help, so training on the product details, training on the clinical aspects of managing tinnitus patients, and training on the business issues about creating tinnitus as part of your practice. And getting the details right about a tinnitus practice is tricky. And we've been learning and learning and learning over the past year how to do that well from people who really know what they're doing. And we'll share that sort of information. If you really think that you're going to get into tinnitus in a big way, we would strongly encourage you to consider taking one of these independent courses and learning a treatment approach like TRT or CBT or some of the other acronyms. There's a lot of good people out there who know a lot about tinnitus, and you can learn a lot from them. We will do as much as we possibly can to get you moving in the right direction, but there's professionals who you can learn from that will tell you even more about what's going on. We understand that tinnitus is a tremendous burden on so many patients, and we understand that it is a great business opportunity for those who are really willing to go in with both feet. And we're going to do everything we can to try to help those of you who are really interested to take that leap into the area of tinnitus and really grow your practice. Now, for those of you who currently do tinnitus in a big way, you'll be very happy with this product. As soon as you get your first products next week, you can go with it because you'll have all the details you need to know, very intuitive software, very easy, and you'll see that in the workshops this weekend. As I said, we're hearing care professionals, but we're also sense professionals. Our job is to understand how disorders of hearing can create a disruption in the total sensory experience that the patient has. Soft sound perception and the way we've dealt with that, tinnitus and the way we've dealt with that, are two very clear examples where we can do a better and better job as a profession about dealing with some of the most difficult problems that patients have. I hope you'll see in the new product lineup we have with the Indian Sense products that we have addressed these issues in a very positive and very effective way, and it gives you folks even better opportunities to expand your business, expand your clinical practice, and bring really great hearing care to more and more patients every day. Thank you for your time.